Hello there. I'm delighted to say that I'm here with my very good friend Cameron John Robbins, the gentleman artist, and we are going to go through a series of Cameron's outstanding portraits of historical figures, modern and historic. And Cameron will talk about the portraits, what inspired them, about the individuals, the portraits themselves, how they came about. I will talk about them from a facial analysis perspective. So without further ado, let me bring up the first image to share.
Here we have Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, most famous for writing the Gulag Archipelago, which was an expose of the Gulag system in Soviet Russia. I first became aware of him through the university lectures of Jordan Peterson that are published on YouTube. And I subsequently went through the Gulag Archipelago. I went through it as an audiobook, but I mean, it's very long, it's very extensive. It will shatter you. Speaking of emotions, it will emotionally shatter a person. And it's so worth doing. There are so many things to learn from his work to make ourselves better, to make societies better. So many warnings against what not to do, and so much suffering to learn those lessons. Not only him personally, but countless millions of people. It's something I learned from the Gulag Archipelago. It is remarkably easy to torture a person beyond their endurance. It's frighteningly easy. One of the great lessons of the Gulag Archipelago, one of the things that he articulates is, I'm going to misquote it, but I'll say paraphrase, that the line between good and evil runs down the middle of each human heart. The distance between civility and beastliness is frighteningly short. The distance between civilization and anarchy and brutality is frighteningly short. And we need to be vigilant, not only over our communities and our governments, but ourselves, because we're all part of the same system. What I realized from his work and other sources is that tyranny and brutality is a human problem. It's the tendency of all governments over time to drift towards tyranny and authoritarianism. Whatever system of government you start with, because that's a human tendency. I mean, think about your own experience. I think anybody listening will be able to identify this. When we can barely promote someone to the position of supervisor over half a dozen people without creating a petty tyrant, this is a human problem. Because governments are administered and run by human beings. And so whether we're talking about a manager at a fast food restaurant or a president of a homeowners association or a bureaucrat in a first world government or a political activist in an NGO. It's like, it's a human problem, because interacting with each other and doing it properly is a lot of work. Being a leader and doing it properly is a lot of work. The emotional control, the emotional maturity, the self-awareness, the sensitivity to other people, the insights, not only into other people, but into ourselves and our motivations and why we do what we do, the exercise of restraint, all of these things are hard work. It's much easier to just be a bully and a tyrant. It causes tremendous damage to do that on all levels, whether that's in a romantic relationship or as a parent or as a president or prime minister. But that's partly my point. This is a human problem. And it's only at the individual level that we can choose to refrain from bullying and tyrannical behaviors to get our way. And this is part of the problem, is because the outcome we want, we might be right. The thing we want, the outcome we say we're in favor of, we could be right. That might be the best thing. That might be the right thing. That may not matter if we achieve it in destructive ways. So the whole idea of by any means necessary is a tremendously flawed and dangerous approach to anything. And Solzhenitsyn articulated that and illustrated that in the Gulag Archipelago and his other writings, I'm sure, marvelously, beautifully, intelligently, and overwhelmingly in terms of an emotional experience. It will crush your soul to read those things that he describes, the things that people endured. And yet the part of your soul that is crushed by those truths maybe should be. Maybe there's a part of us that ought to be crushed with that kind of overwhelming, brutal capacity of human beings, and to realize that under the right circumstances, with the right motivation, we might have been any one of the people that he describes. We might have been thrown into the gulag. We might have also been the guard. We might have been the fellow prisoner who sells out another prisoner. Under the right circumstances, we might be the person who reports their neighbor to the government for something that sends them to the gulag simply because we like their flat better than ours. It's monstrous to consider that we might be capable of those things, but scale it back and realize, how is that fundamentally different than a lie you might have told as a child to get an extra cookie from your parents, or when you stole your sibling's cookie when they weren't looking? I mean, if fundamentally these behaviors are the same. And so there are parts of ourselves that we ought to be confronted with, which are monstrous, and we need to interact with them in a Jungian sense. We need to learn about the monsters that we have inside of ourselves so that we can control them consciously, incorporate them to where they're under our control, to where we understand our human capacity for monstrousness. And that's the only way to tame the monster, is to incorporate it.
Let me put these two images together. The first thing about Solzhenitsyn, you can see it very clearly on Cameron's portrait here, this very deep, long, vertical line. And in the Chinese system, that's referred to as the hanging needle or the hanging blade. And I'm very clear that I do not do fortune telling, but there are elements of facial features that would be regarded as being linked to fate, F-A-T-E. So when we see that very deep, long, vertical line like that, it's one of those features. And when we see that, it's taken as being an indication that the person has had either a non-relationship or a very difficult relationship with their father. And interestingly enough, Solzhenitsyn's father died before he was born. So we obviously never had the opportunity to meet with his father. But we also take it further then. It's also associated with somebody who has never or has had great difficulty connecting with their own power. And one of the themes running through Solzhenitsyn's life, both in the Soviet Union and in the West when he lived there, when he was initially exiled, and then when he moved to Germany, and when West Germany as it was, and moved then to the US, that there was always that sense of being a man out of place, that he was, for want of a better term, metaphorically at least, banging his head against the system, rebelling against the system, because he never quite seemed to find his place, and where he really expressed himself was obviously his writing. And even there, he had a lot of difficulty. Obviously, there was a time he was allowed to write. There was a time he was prevented from writing. There was a time when his writings were banned. There was a time when his writings were taken by the KGB. And then was a time when he just felt very much out of favor in the West, because he became very critical. So there was a lot of struggle in his life, and not just in this image, but you'll see it in repeated images, and you'll see it right through his life. There are a lot of dark lines and darkness underneath the eyes, but also the eyes themselves are looking at you. They're really scrutinizing you. So this is a man who was always wondering, do I belong here? Is it safe? And I'm reminded of something I heard many years ago when I worked as a therapist, and I used to meet with other therapists on a regular basis, with exchange experiences, etc. And this lady worked with people who've been tortured. That was the area of focus for her. And one of the things she said to me was that the fact that somebody's been tortured does not mean they're a nice person. And we tend to assume that victims of torture are nice, that they have been mistreated. Well, we know they've been mistreated because nobody should be tortured, but that they are
right.
somehow by definition nice people. And I've always had that question about Solzhenitsyn. I don't have the answer, but I've always had that question about Solzhenitsyn, as to whether he was actually a nice person. And like I say, I don't have the answer, and I'm not in any way inferring that he should have been mistreated, because nobody should have experienced anything like the humiliation, torture, degradation he did. But the question is just there for me.
Right. I have no idea. To your point about him always being a person who felt out of place, I have a suspicion about that. I can't confirm it from his writings, but I have a sense that he was first and foremost a Russian, meaning he deeply loved his country. And it was painful for him to essentially have had his country taken away from him, not only by the political system, which took over his country and made it impossible for him to stay there. Just, whether it was Germany or the United States or anywhere else he went, they weren't his country. They weren't necessarily bad countries. And he leveled some very insightful criticisms at Western governments as well. It's like, look, my country's been down this road. Stop what you're doing. This is a terrible idea. I can tell you firsthand, but no, kind of like, losing your mother perhaps as a child. The way that would feel might be similar to the way he felt about Russia.
Yeah.
And I just think he missed his country all of his life. What it had been, what it should have been, what it meant to him.
Yeah, even while he was there.
Even while he was there, yes.